Today we will be looking at two terms or two expressions that have obvious connections to peace and conflict studies. One of them is very well known, very famous. It's part of the general conversation, something that everybody knows about is human rights. And we have discussed it already a number of times. The second one is much less known, human security, and many people probably never heard of it or don't know exactly what that's supposed to mean. But in the last few decades, it has become increasingly well known within the United Nations community and peace studies and development studies as well. So we're going to look at them and also why do we need both? Human rights, human security, what's the difference? And the subtitle here is Attempts to Transcend Negative Peace, because all these things are there to make peace more than just let's stop for a moment shooting and start again right away when it fits us. So creates the conditions for positive peace, what Immanuel Kant already had suggested with his uh, articles and many others. So let's have a look. Human rights did not start with the Declaration of Human Rights, but that's the document that basically is like it's the constitution of human rights in a way that puts it on the map. And that was right at the same time or around the same time the United Nations were founded at the end of World War II, and Eleanor Roosevelt, we have seen this already, has been the main force, the main inspiration behind the Human Rights Universal Declaration. And as you can see here, it's related to the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular number 16, which kind of encompasses all the others. I'll read. The universal, that means it's for everybody, simple. Indivisible, that's important. That means you cannot say, or governments cannot say, you people can have this universal right, like the right to free speech, but they cannot have that universal right, the right against political violence or whatever. Indivisible, you have them or you don't have them. At least that's the requirement. Equitable, that means fair. And indispensable claims, it's not just something like additionally, if you like it, it's essential. Claims and meaning claims that you can claim them. In other words, individual citizens of this world can go to court against their own government if they feel that their human rights are not being respected. Sometimes it's like, good luck with going to court. So that's the enforcement problem, but the right is there. Claims and entitlements. Entitlements is a word that can have a negative sound to it, especially nowadays and currently, especially in the United States, perhaps. You hear that word entitlement all the time, meaning rich people feel entitled. Because I'm rich, I'm entitled to be rich, basically. Like I have it better, but that's normal. It's because it's me. And, I have that's, of course, both logically stupid and very unfair and immoral, whatever. And poor people, on the other hand, can also, do not have to, but can sometimes have an entitlement mentality towards the government. In other words, I expect the government to do everything for me. I get unemployment, so I don't work, I don't try to find. So this word can have a negative connotation. However, we are, and this is the whole point of human rights, entitled. That means we have the right to certain things legitimately. And these are the human rights that are endowed to all persons simply by the sake of being human. And that's great. simply by the fact of being human. That means, say, because I am a human being, I have the right to this and that. I have human rights. Not because I'm Swiss, not because I'm old, not because I'm a man, not because I'm this, not because I'm that, not even because I'm innocent. Everybody, without exception, has these fundamental human rights. That's rather new, rather new. Even as a principle, as a legal principle, this is legal stuff. It's something that governments owe to their citizens. Now, everybody, just for the fact of being human, comes to mind, yeah, what about criminals? That is actually there. I just highlighted one of the articles in the Declaration that speaks about that. The others are there. You can stop and read them. No one shall be subjected to torture, cruel or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. That applies to people who are in jail waiting to be judged and people who have been found guilty. So you can see that doesn't mean they cannot be punished. But even then, the fact that they're a human being that deserves respect protects them at least against being treated in a way that destroys their human dignity. Then, as many times happens, when the international community, and it's the same for different countries, creates a certain principle and enshrines it in law, in some declaration, in this case, a declaration, after a while, people realize that certain things were maybe not covered completely or not highlighted enough. Then another proclamation is made or another covenant. They have many different terms that seem to be redundant because repeating the same thing, but each time it emphasizes something that was not there or it covers something that was left out. Suddenly you realize, oh, but there's some new development technologically, it's left out. So don't be surprised that sometimes it looks like, is that the one I looked at before? No, that's a new one. You will see the complexities of human life, especially in the 21st century, leads to that. This is just to reinforce what I just said. All persons deprived of their liberty shall be treated with humanity and with respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. And then you have one more, all prisoners shall be treated with the respect due to their inherent dignity and value as human beings. Now, why do I insist on that? Because it's always the way minorities or people exposed, even by their own fault, more exposed than others, the way these people are treated is what always shows the limit of any great proclamation or a law. So if you can show that even the people most exposed and most unlikely to be covered are covered, then you have shown that it is really covered. And that's the point here. Nevertheless, it's universal and it's not absolute. Just in case you wonder, in the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law, for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others, and morality, public order, and general welfare. In other words, the Declaration of Human Rights acknowledges that sometimes the usual human rights enjoyed by people in general can be curtailed if that person commits a crime or if the state needs to do something to prevent this from affecting other people, including, the whole process of being judged and so on. So it's not like human rights means everybody can do whatever they want, killing other people. No, obviously not. We knew it, but just to confirm. Now, when did human rights appear in humankind? When did, for the first time, people start thinking of human rights? I'm not a specialist of the history of civilizations, and that's for another time. Um, Obviously, all major religions and civilizations have had some kind of an acknowledgement that human rights exist, mostly because we are seen as children or even servants of God. So it's usually connected to something transcendent uh, that says that human beings are precious. And it's not just a matter of me personally wanting to be free. It's something that I have a value that transcends me, and therefore I should be respected. So that exists pretty much all around the world. And there have been laws in various parts of the world for a very, very long time. Confucianism had a clear vision of human rights, others, Buddha certainly, Jesus, needless to say, it's very clear in his words. Um, but indeed, other parts of the world that you wouldn't think of too. For instance, in Africa, in West Africa, the Empire of Mali had mostly oral laws that acknowledged human rights. Now, I could be more specific, but just generally, just saying that this is not just something that happens here in the West. However, the central history that affected the rest of the world was the West, particularly until recently, Europe. So we are going to look at that. That's what led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on. And in that particular context, for instance, specifically, human rights were surprisingly absent. After the end of the Roman Empire, where there were some human rights, some legal protections, but limited, the collapse into the age of darkness, and then the Middle Ages, you had feudal lords, then you had absolute rulers, king this, king that in various countries. They did whatever they wanted. So the notion that human beings, all human beings especially, that means including the serfs, were not much better off than slaves, the peasants, and even anybody else, including aristocrats, had a fundamental human right to be treated fairly according to universal principles that did not exist. Of course, there were some here and there, certainly people who spoke about it, and certainly also rulers who respected certain human rights to some certain degree, but it was not anchored in the general consciousness. And that started to change in all over the Western world, pretty much around the same time towards the end of the 18th century. And here we will be talking about Voltaire. He's a very famous French writer and philosopher who, among other things, defended minority rights. He hated the church, and the church was quite oppressive in his time, working together with the government. And he therefore was fascinated by cases of people, specifically Protestants. He was Catholic, but not religious. And of course, the Catholic Church controlled France. Protestants were accused sometimes of things that they were totally innocent of just because they were Protestants. That sounds perhaps familiar. And they were executed in a number of cases. Voltaire started taking on some of these cases since he was very famous. He didn't have any power, but he had the power of fame. He sometimes won, and he campaigned for these people. And so at the beginning of his life, and for much of his life, he was indignant, and his whole fight was again injustice, bigotry, that means religious prejudice, unfair treatment of the innocent. In other words, he fought against the mistreatment of the innocent. However, in his writings, you can see that he did not really mind too much when people were found to be guilty, and he agreed, yeah, they were guilty, you know, they committed this or that crime, and then they were executed in horrible ways because they were guilty. So his focus at the beginning of his life was the proper treatment of innocent people. And then sometime during his life and during all his long campaigns for human rights, he changed and he started fighting for against the violations of fundamental human rights for everybody, including those convicted of crimes. So his life is a very interesting way to pinpoint pretty much the time when somehow suddenly it became obvious to everybody that people have human rights and that you cannot mistreat people. And even if they commit mistake, they have to pay a price, but they still are people who have human dignity, which is something that today most of us acknowledge and understand. Not always practice, as always. You have the right and the acknowledgement, and then those who violate them. But that's the time when this happens. Now, in the case of Voltaire, that led directly to the French Revolution. Voltaire lived around the time of Kant. He was 30 years older. So there was this idea, like Kant had, perpetual peace, so that it was all coming. It was the end of absolute power by monarchy, you know, the absolute kings who had total power. Um, and this change of mentality. In France, it was quite not religious. It was independently of religion, just in terms of we have natural rights. And it led to the French Revolution. And you can say, well, that's some kind of a contradiction because French Revolution was so bloody. People were beheaded by the dozen, no, by or more than by just like thousands of people. The reign of terror until the one who started it was beheaded himself and it stopped. However, you can argue that even the guillotine, you know, the machine to cut people's heads off conveniently, was invented by a doctor, the Dr. Guillotin, who was concerned about the human rights, you could say, of those sentenced to death and wanted them to be able to die painlessly instead of being, you know, brutally killed or try to behead them with a sword, and it doesn't work. You have to horrible things. So there was even there, you could say that's the sense of human rights. And however, if you go now to the other side of the Atlantic, where again, around the same time, a little bit earlier, the United States revolution occurred. That one was bloody because it was a war against England, not wanted by the colonies. But anyway, however, the revolution itself and the new free government chosen by, you know, with the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution was not bloody. It was also religious with a different sense. So you can see some difference between the two. I will not insist on that, but just reading the US Declaration of Independence, you see, we hold these truths to be self-evident. These are very famous words. Self-evident means it's obvious. And you can imagine it didn't become obvious just the day before. It means at some point somebody realizes and puts it on paper. It's obvious that we all are fundamentally equal and so on. So it means it's been coming. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator. So it's not just natural law. We just happen to be equal, but because of God, with certain unalienable rights. No matter what happens, we keep them. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, the governments are instituted. So that shows again, the governments don't give you the right. The right is God-given, or even if you don't believe in God, given by nature, it's natural. Governments are not there to give you the right, they're there to protect your rights. They are not there to oppress you, they're there to protect your rights and to secure them. So the word secure means make sure that you actually have them. You have the rights, they are given by your creator or by nature. Nobody can give or take them away from you, but they are not secure unless somebody protects them, and that's the role of the government. So security. So you see, we are moving now from human rights to the notion of human security. And you will see now that even in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is about rights, there is a link to human security. It's not very visible, but in you have Article 1, 2, 3. I'll let you read them. These are the most famous, the opening salvo of the Human Rights Declaration. But Article 3 says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of persons. So security means you are safe. And again, you will not be safe unless you have a surrounding that guarantees your safety or your security. Now, the discourse on human rights and human security is ongoing, and generally everybody acknowledges the notion of human rights. Human security is sometimes being criticized by human rights experts who say, but why do you add human security? Because human rights, it's all there, and it's true. The facts, the right to this, and that are not very different from the security to do this, and that. It's all the things that naturally we should have the right to do or to be. However, there's a very simple way. You can say it's simplistic, and I agree. It's simplified, at least. It's just to give you a simple way to understand the difference. It's much more complex than that, of course. And that is, rights is what you should get. It's a legal term. A legal term says that you have the right to this. Nobody can prevent a criminal from taking that right away from you, except that then he will have to pay the price, and to the extent possible, you will be reimbursed, so to speak. But you have the right. That doesn't guarantee that you have it. Security is what you really get, not what you should get, right? Really get security. So, for instance, the legal right to education or healthcare is very different from access to education and healthcare. So I think it's pretty obvious that we have to make the distinction between the two, and that the legal framework created by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not enough in itself. It's a framework that tells governments what they should do. But then comes the concern, not to say it again in different words, but to look at the situation worldwide and in each country and look at the way this is being implemented. Is it being implemented? Are changes necessary? So let's take healthcare. Even though it's guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and even in the Charter of the United Nations, by the way, all these things are already there, not as explicit, but they're there. Even though it's guaranteed, even though you live in a country that has that in its constitution, maybe even free universal healthcare, maybe free or not free, but in any case, everybody has the right to healthcare. But you live in the jungle, 3 hours away from the next hospital. You have no car. And even if you did, you will not find gasoline because you have no money. And even if you had the money, there is no gasoline around. Even if you had both, you have to travel for 3 hours to a rebel-infested territory where you will probably be kidnapped, and the road is so bad, etc. And even if you get through, you're lucky, you get to the hospital, it's been burned down by the rebels. So even if it's still there, they have no medication. I don't want to continue. I could go on and on and on. That means in many cases worldwide, the way for people to access the right that on paper they have is filled with one obstacle after another. We all know that. Even in developed countries, there are obstacles, but not to speak, of course, in the so-called global south. And the human security discourse is mostly aimed at these situations. That it's not enough to say you have the right to this and that. You have to check, do you have access? Do you have that security? So I think that should be clear. Now, one important thing always is to convince the governments that they have to, even if they've signed a piece of paper, it's not always enough, and that it's in their interest. The best way to convince somebody to do something they don't really want to do is to convince them it's not only nice of you, it's not only your duty, it's in your interest. So human rights is one thing. The different nations, their governments, they are more concerned about national security. That means their sovereignty. So if you combine both human rights and national security, you have human security. And the point here that is being made is that human security is actually essential for national security. You may think that for the national security, all you need is a military, a strong military. But if every one of your, or the majority of your citizens are miserable, unhealthy, uneducated, sick, etc., all that, then your national security is not guaranteed. You cannot wage war properly. You cannot defend yourself properly. And, everything will be not working well. So it's in the interest of the government to consider the cause of human security. So that is a point that was made, and that is being made. So here, this is based on a human rights scholar from Canada, who is actually critical of human security, and you can read it. The choice of the term security is meant to persuade governments that citizens' security is state security. If citizens are insecure, then states are insecure. That's what I essentially said. And you see, human security and national security, they overlap at least to a certain point, and they're all in the sphere of peace. Now, historically, and again, I'm not going to go into the details, they are not relevant for this course really. In 1994, after years of preparatory work, human security was enshrined by the United Nations Development Program, or Human Development Report in 1994. That essentially is the work of Mahbub ul Haq, sorry for the mispronunciation, a Pakistani diplomat at the United Nations. Of course, he didn't do it himself, but he was in charge of the project, and he deserves credit for that. The United Nations voted on that, and that report was approved. It highlights 7 points of human security that are necessary for full human security to exist. One, so it's specific. It's maybe still not very specific, but at least it identifies specific points. One, economic security. If you have no money, you cannot buy food, you starve to death. So, and that's just one aspect. Two, food security. Even if you have money to buy food, but if there is no food, if there's a drought, you starve. So somehow governments are responsible for their people, towards their people, to make sure that they have enough means to live, and that they have also the things they need that are available on the market. And other governments are responsible to help that country. So that's like a R2P thing, right? Health security. Again, you need to be able to pay for your health bills unless it's all free, but you need to have hospitals, doctors, etc. Then environmental security, that's new compared to the old ones. Like 100 years ago, there was no such concept. Global warming, all these things. So that's something that is new, and even compared to the human rights, that's one area that is being covered, not just because historically human security came later. So global warming, if you are flooded because of global warming, you have no security. Personal security, you should be able to go out at night without fearing to be attacked. Community security, that means the community you live in, including its ethnic identity, should be protected. You should not be exposed to the destruction of the community you live in. And finally, political security. Political security means you should be able to tell the government that you don't agree without being arrested. So these different elements of human security have been highlighted. And as you can imagine, there were committees and so on, and it's still ongoing, that are tasked with making sure that every country wants to create conditions that guarantee these types of security and is able to, wants to, that's the political will, not being dictatorial and not tyrannical towards one's own people, but also capable. That's why you have the World Bank. I mean, many different things that are meant to help countries that are struggling with this. Now, going back a little bit in history, showing the genesis of that notion of human security, you have this gentleman, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, who was a great idealist. He created the League of Nations, again, not single-handedly, but he was the instrumental in its creation, but then the US didn't join. He was an idealist, but he was also a very flawed human being. He was extremely racist, even for the time, and so on. We have that often, and it's good to know that all these great people, they are very flawed, which is also encouraging because it shows today God can work with people that are very flawed. If you wait for the perfect person to come to create the perfect world, that will never happen. In any case, he wrote 14 points just before the end of World War I, where he spoke about many, many things, basically the conditions to start again on a good footing after the war. And it concludes with, what we demand in this war, therefore, is that the world we be made fit and safe to live in. Safe to live in, security, safety. It is the principle of justice to all peoples and nationalities and their right to live on equal terms of liberty and safety, security, with one another, whether they be strong or weak. So I said before that Voltaire's time is a time when somehow human rights came into the, entered general consciousness, began rather suddenly to be generally accepted. Human security also started to be accepted basically at the beginning of the 20th century. And then after World War II, excuse me, you had the even more famous four freedoms that FDR, President Franklin Roosevelt, mentioned in his State to the Union address in 1941. That was 1 year before Pearl Harbor. And he already says we have to be prepared. The most of the speech was about being ready, and basically, I need more funds for the military about war, because we should not expect that if somebody wants to attack us, they will say, hey, I'm going to attack you. They will attack us suddenly. So he already had that understanding. He was still very shocked when the Japanese attacked on Pearl Harbor towards the end of that year. But obviously, he was aware of that possibility. But towards the end of the speech, he speaks about the future and about what humankind really needs. And again, it's new. Wilson here speaks about nations should be free and safe regardless of whether they are strong or weak. That never happened. You are strong, you are safe to the extent that you don't have war with another country that's even stronger. But if you are weak, you don't have any security unless a strong nation protects you. So this comes again as principles. Here, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, we know that. That's part of the Human Rights Declaration. And freedom from fear, freedom from want. That is more, he doesn't use the term human security, but you should be able to speak freely, to worship freely, without having fear that it will be interrupted by the government or by an invading army. So that notion of they are two sides of the same thing, of course, and free from want. That's the Turkey. That's a famous representation of these four freedoms. The turkey on the Thanksgiving dinner, that means you can enjoy. You don't want. Want in this case means not to have enough, to be poor, essentially. So human security, you should be safe and you should have enough to live. Again, just to show that these things were in the coming, and specifically in the United States. Now, application of that in the human security discourse and the way human security came to be acknowledged in 1994 and then continue being practiced and sometimes not practiced. You have many different trends, and I will not go into that. This article on human security by Howard Hassman will give you some of it. But specifically, there is two approaches traditionally, then it became more complicated. The Japanese approach, ostensibly stressing development or freedom from want. In other words, against poverty. That's the focus of the Japanese government's focus on human security, helping poor countries in the global south financially, economically. On the other hand, the Canadian approach was focused on freedom from fear, political freedom, human rights being actually respected by governments. And that is an illustration somehow on FDR's 4 points. Now, the same person, the same human rights scholar, as I said before, was quite critical of human security. She admitted that they are useful in certain ways, but in many ways they just are saying the same thing, basically blah, 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 to say the same thing as human rights in a different way. As I already said, I believe that there is a very legitimate perspective of human security. Unlike just the legal perspective, what is the right of people, you look at what's the situation on the ground. That's obviously it should be related, hopefully, but that's a different look and a look that deserves to be had. So I'm not that critical of the notion of security. Also, some people that I know say, well, security, when you speak of security, what you really mean is you do that militarily. You don't speak about the security to believe this or that. And that person actually told me that, you see, we were entering the United Nations. What do? That the guards, they protect you and they protect everybody else at UN by making sure that you don't have a gun. That's why they check you out. They don't check, if you haven't eaten enough for breakfast. And I think that's true, but that's just one aspect of security, the most visible one. But even during COVID, they would check that you have a mask. Actually, they closed, but then when they reopened, they checked you have a mask. So there are many different aspects of security. So we should not be, hypnotized by the weapons thing. However, Howard Hassman's critique is that it's vague. Yes, it can be vague, but as we have seen, it is still the 7 points that are very clear, and the way it is applied need not be vague. Redundant duplicates the human rights discourse. That's I don't quite think so, even though, of course, there's a lot of overlap and diplomats like to talk a lot. And since most of the time what they say is just words, you can get that feeling, more words. Let's have some action instead of more words. Okay. And the key point that she emphasizes is potentially counterproductive. Oh, it potentially actually endangers what the human rights discourse was already trying to do. So how is that? How can it be dangerous? States must protect the rights of their individual citizens. That's a human right. I have it, I can go to court over it. They may not derogate from the rights of some individuals in the name of protection of the national people. You cannot put one person in jail because even unfairly, because that person disrupts public order or is annoying. But everybody else can be fine, so you cannot do that. If you start doing that, it's a slippery slope. You're already on the slope, and very quickly everybody you don't like will be in jail. So human rights, you cannot make exceptions. Individual citizens possess the legal right to demand that their human rights be enforced. Whereas the individual has no standing in the human security discussion, because human security is the extent to which in a particular place, country, or region, human rights are followed, are realized, are becoming enforced. You can say human security is the way human rights are enforced. And if 95% of the country has access to water in the global south, you can say, well, that's pretty good. It's pretty good because 30 years ago it was only 42%. So from that perspective, looking at the whole picture, it's pretty good. But if the 5% who don't have access, it's just because they live in the mountains as far away, and these are the 5% that they haven't reached yet, then it's pretty good, and we can expect that the 5% will be reached in the coming few years. But if the 5% are the 5% that oppose the government, and therefore they are shut off, they have no access because they are intentionally not given access, it will still look like it's only 5%, so it looks pretty good. But from a human rights perspective, it's bad, because 5% who, anytime, if the government chooses so, can affect somebody else. So that's what she's trying to say. In the name of a pretty good human security record, which is about statistics largely, you can have horrible human rights record. That's why she says if you focus too much on human security and forget human rights, saying we don't need them anymore, that is then the human security discourse becomes dangerous. Now, she does recognize that human security in what she calls the narrow sense as something that has to be added to what's already in the human rights discourse, because that came like 40, 50 years after the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration. Certain things have changed in the world, and certain mega threats have appeared that are not covered by human rights. So I said that's okay. And whether it's only that, in any case, I need to speak about it. So the narrow view of human security proposes stronger enforcement mechanisms to the international community to remedy extreme human rights violations, whether interstate or intrastate. And she mentions also, and generally it's common knowledge, global warming. If you're on a Pacific island, not so long ago, it was not a concern at all, but now your land disappears, and soon you have a sovereignty over water. You don't exist anymore. So these things should be handled by the international community. They are not in the Human Rights Declaration. And many such things. The huge migrations due to war, Syrian refugees in Europe and South American economic mostly and political refugees in the United States. All these things have to be handled, and they are currently quite a mess. So that kind of concern of expressed by the human security gang, if you want, is acknowledged even by this critical person. Now, one more step. I mentioned that at the very beginning. Human development is also connected to human rights, human security, human development. We need the rights. We need the security. That means the right should be actual access to the rights. That's security. And only with that can we then expect to have real human development. Because if people have no rights, no freedoms, no security, none of these things, how can a country develop? Now, how is development measured? That will again be another, it's interesting, right? It's complex, but it shows you all the things that are needed. And that's why it's not enough just to say peace, peace, peace. So here, human security means protecting the vital core of all human lives in ways that enhance human freedoms and human fulfillment, which you can also call development. Now, human fulfillment is, again, it's vague, but of course, unificationists have a very clear vision of what that means. But even normal people have a certain vision. You should be able to enjoy life reasonably, to be productive, and to do things you want to do. So human security means protecting people from critical, that means severe and pervasive, widespread global warming threats and situations. So it highlights that particular concern that I just mentioned. Human security implies safe access, not just right for all, to medical, etc. facilities and protection from direct violence. So that just reinforces. Now, this is a gentleman that I recommend you read. In this week, there's just a very short reading by him, but there's a book that he wrote that I will come to in a moment that I strongly recommend you read. His name is Amartya Sen. He is Indian, actually Bangladesh. Today it's Bangladesh, British citizen, American, professor at Harvard, studied at Cambridge, so elite, who received the Nobel Prize in economics, and who is, of course, due probably in part at least to his origins, very much concerned with human development, human rights, human security, and especially its application in the global south. And he brings in some very interesting perspective that will also help with understanding what we've been speaking about until now. Development, so he speaks about not about rights or security, but development is not only about the growth of GNP, gross national product, per head. That means how rich basically the country is, how much money they make by individual or global, whatever. but also about the expansion of human freedom and dignity. So you see, freedom, dignity, human rights, human security. So he links, in other words, human rights and human security to the notion of how developed a country is. That's very important. Now, he's not the only one. And by the way, the Pakistani diplomat who was behind the human security report of 1994 was influenced by Amartya Sen. I mean, they're part of the same group of people. They're always working together with the scholar in the background and so on. This lady, Sadako Ogata, was quite famous. She passed away now, and she was the head of the High Commissioner. She was the High Commissioner for Refugees with headquarters in Geneva, and she was very influential in that discourse. She writes, human development is about widening the range of people's choices to lead lives that they value. Like, in the past, I could walk somewhere, then I was able to take a horse and then a car, and now an airplane. It widens the scope of what I can do, but also accounts for unforeseen downfalls or reversals of development. So in addition to the new threats that are coming, that have come lately, like global warming and refugee crises and worldwide epidemics like COVID, which are it's much more threatening today because of all the interaction that we have. In addition to that, you have sometimes even people who have everything or thinks they have everything, or at least a lot, suddenly they lose it. So human security should also take care of that. And why, she's Japanese, why do the Japanese, as I explained before, at least historically, did they focus on freedom from wants? That mean economic struggles. Because that came at the time of the Asian economic crisis in the 90s. Korea was hit very hard, and many other countries. I think we forgot because we're not in Asia, at least I am not, and it was 30 years ago, but that was a big downturn. In South Korea, for instance, I know from one Korean student I had, people would, at one point, people started selling their golden wedding rings and donating the money to the government out of patriotism, which is actually quite incredible. Because the government was unable to live up to its duties and expectations. So it was pretty bad. And in these cases, people who already had a very high level of development suddenly became poor again. So that's also one focus of human security, this human security discourse. You still have the rights. In terms of human rights, you keep the legal right, but you don't have it. You don't have access to it because there's no means. So that's where human security comes in. So here you have the book that I mentioned before by Amartya Sen, Development as Freedom. And he has also written articles where he says capability expansion. That's essentially the same. Capability is what you are capable of doing, what you are free, not necessarily just your personal ability, but what you are allowed by circumstances to do. You expand that. That means you expand your freedom. He said freedom to do what? Essentially what you as a human being can reasonably be expected to want to do. And it doesn't matter what it is, you should be able to do it as long as it does not prevent other people from having. So there's some guardrail, there are some guardrails there. And he says that is what allows for the conversion of formal rights into real rights. As I said it before, from rights, the right to access, actually having that right. And this is a book, I don't know, 200-300 pages. Don't graduate from this program without reading it. Of course, nothing's going to happen if you don't, but I would say it's worth reading. Very easy reading. And of course, I'm not subscribing to everything he says, he has his perspectives, but it's an essential basic step. Here you have a statistical chart that shows, I think, in a really incredibly clear way what he means. This is, of course, 1985. It has completely changed since. And you have GNP per capita, that means how rich the country is. And usually, economists decide whether a country is developed or not based on that. That means how rich the country is, how wealthy. If it has a very high GNP, then it's a rich country. If it is a very low one, it's a poor country. So you see, again, this doesn't apply anymore today, but in 1985, not that long ago, GNP in China, 310, I believe it's US dollars, but it doesn't matter. And then on the complete other end, Oman, that's next to Saudi Arabia, 6,730 times. That's more than 20 times. But then you look at life expectancy in China, 69 years old. That's pretty good. 310, that's catastrophic. That was catastrophic. 69, pretty good. On Sri Lanka, which was also just about as poor, even better, 70. Oman, 20 times richer. Life expectancy, 54. So what does that mean? It suggests, or more than suggests, that in Oman, an oil-rich country, at that time, there were few people who were extraordinarily rich. And obviously they had a life expectancy that was quite good, I'm sure. And no matter how many people were poor, these people were so rich that the average went up enormously. But most people lived poor. And because they were poor, most people didn't live long. And so in terms of statistics of how much people live long, it's very bad. And his point, Amartya Sen's point, is you cannot call Oman a developed country over China or over Sri Lanka just because it's so rich. In practice, the population at large is not developed. So again, these are all the data, but the principle is very clear there. So this was a breakthrough, new perspective of looking at what development is. And it's very well known. And it, of course, relates to everything we're talking about today. Human rights. What about the human rights of the people who lived only 54 years old on average? Human security goes along. It's safe to say that the government did not respect human rights very much. And accordingly, there was little human security. And accordingly, the prospect for positive peace, they were not that great because social justice, not that great. Therefore, social justice, not that great. So it all comes together. Now, back to the Declaration of Human Rights. Actually, it's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but actually it's not that universal. It's not fully universal. Actually, out of all the countries that were members of the United Nations on December 10, 1948, China was still not communist China. Not all countries voted in favor. Actually, no country voted against the declaration. None, because I think it would have looked bad. because it sounds so natural and so beautiful. You don't want to be the bad guy. But some abstained. And two countries, instead of abstaining, voting, I abstained, they just didn't participate in the vote, which is the same thing, Honduras and Yemen. But those who voted, who abstained, that means not yes, not no, you can see the reasons why. And that shows you how much it's not so universal. That means even in terms of the rights, you are still not there to have everybody accept all these rights as being universal. Saudi Arabia abstained, obviously because religious freedom. That is not Saudi Arabia. It's very conservative religiously and socially, and Islam governs the country, so there's no religious freedom. The Soviet bloc didn't like the notion of freedom, obviously, and South Africa, which at that time had the apartheid rule, didn't agree with the freedom and equality, regardless of your race, color, and so on. So they couldn't vote for it, but they didn't vote against it either. They just abstained. But that shows you that there was no universal agreement. So this leads us to the final point, which is that this so-called universal, that's like the final accusation against human rights, and that the human rights discourse is actually not universal. They managed to have a universal declaration. Why? Because they were in control. That's true. United States, especially, and other Western powers after World War II, they decided pretty much what was happening, not for long. And they framed their Western perspective as universal, but actually it's a Western discourse. In particular, because human rights is all about the individual, whereas human security is about the collective global community. So because of that, the emphasis on human rights has been seen by some as one-sided global north perspective. You have the luxury to worry about every single individual having his human rights protected, right? Even if one person doesn't get what he deserves, he can sue the government. We in the global south, we don't have the luxury to do that. 1/3 of our population doesn't have access to running water. We care for each individual, of course, but we don't have the luxury to focus on that. However, you can say that it is true that the global north can afford to focus on things that the global south does not have the luxury to even think about. However, the notion of right is indeed universal. And I think in the discussion, most people will admit that. For instance, if you have a government in the global south, very poor country, very miserable circumstances, people's security is anything but guaranteed, like the person living far away from a hospital that has already been burned down anyway. But if the government of that country does not respect human rights, human security will never be reached. So the concern for human rights is perfectly legitimate, and there should be no concern about that. Only being concerned about that, yeah, that's a problem, because just keep insisting on everybody has the right, that's one thing. Doing something to have a majority of the population have that human right, that is also necessary, even if not everybody can have it yet. Again, if you had 42% of the population had access to something, and now 95. That's a huge progress in human security. And if the government sincerely tries to give it to the 5 remaining percent, there's no human rights problem. But if it's, say, China, China has made an incredible progress in terms of human security for its population. People now in China, by and large, live well, at least much, much better than before. But entire populations like the Uyghurs and religious people are intentionally cut off from that newly gained prosperity. So whatever percentage they make up, that's not just because the Chinese government is unable to care for them and still trying to get also them to be reached. It's because intentionally the government deprives them. So there it becomes a question of human rights. So both are in this together, so to speak. So the fact that the emphasis on human security has been seen as better reflecting the perspective of the global South is true in a way, and of course you can have your own opinion. It's true in a way that it's a much bigger problem in such countries, but having governments that respect human rights, and of course also in a position to respect them, is essential for the development. So one doesn't contradict the other. Now I will finish with what I think is really the big problem here in the discourse, and creates the conflict at the United Nations in particular, which is the only place where everybody's perspective is there. You have many different countries. For instance, religion is usually not so much present in public policy and the public policy discourse in most countries because they're secular. So for religious people, this is something they worry about. But at the United Nations, well, you have all the Muslim countries, not all Muslim countries, but those like Saudi Arabia and others who are strongly religious, where religion is one with the state to a large extent or fully. They will vote against anything that doesn't recognize the role of religion. So at the UN, you have actually some kind of a balance. It's highly imperfect, but the different trends balance each other out a little bit imperfectly. And so that makes the UN also very interesting. In fact, the opposition against the Western perspective framed as universal aims mainly at some human rights concerns of the West that appear to condone a decadent way of life, appear to certain other countries. And they are summarized in these words: extreme, not elfish, sorry, extreme selfish individualism. So many countries in the world object to the way, let's say, the United States frames human rights over certain concerns that countries have, human rights that they actually don't recognize. That includes, selfish, extreme selfish individualism, the right to do pretty much anything you want. LGBT rights, for instance, is one that is generally recognized in the United States, less today than last year. I don't need to explain why, but it found its place. In many countries, it's considered to be not appropriate. And selfish individualism means I can do anything you want. Definitely, Americans at large are perceived to be very self-indulgent and individualistic in a bad way, not in the sense like independent and you take care of yourself, you pioneer things, all these are the good aspects of being individualistic. But the bad side is generally perceived with some degree of I would say resentment or negative feeling by much of the world, even Europeans sometimes feel that way. because they're framed at that. So I personally, that's my personal perspective, feel that the problem is not so much between human rights and human security or global north and global south. It's that the global north, and especially the United States, is perceived as often in being self-indulgent, and because of that, emphasizing things that are bad in themselves or not really necessary, or perhaps okay, but not at the expense of much more important things that are needed in the global south. However, human rights, the fundamental human rights acknowledged by the United Nations, I believe are essential, and they go hand in hand with the discourse on human security. So I made it clear this is my perspective at the end, and some of it is the perspective of one person or another. But you can believe me that I didn't pick here and there, right and left, people who have extreme views. These are the people who are really have been leading the discourse. And certainly, if you are interested in that particular aspect of this course, you can go much further and discover much more. And I wish that some of you do that. I wish you well. Thank you for listening.